The most interesting part of the China chip story is not sanctions, headlines, or politics, but how quietly behavior has already started to change. On the surface, global supply chains look busy, functional, and resilient. Yet underneath, many companies are acting as if something fragile has already shifted. In my view, that contradiction is the real signal, because markets rarely warn you loudly when the problem is structural rather than sudden. For years, chips were treated as a fast-moving component, something you ordered, shipped, and forgot about once production resumed. That assumption broke during the pandemic, but many people believe the lesson ended when factories reopened and shortages eased. I do not think that is true, because what China represents in this system is not just supply, but concentration of risk. China is not simply a manufacturer of chips. It is a central node where cost, scale, speed, and geopolitics collide. When that node becomes uncertain, even slightly, the entire system starts behaving differently without announcing why. Executives rarely say this directly, but you can hear it when companies talk about redundancy, reshoring, and strategic sourcing. Those words sound technical and boring, yet they are usually used only when trust in the old system starts to fade. In my opinion, the $2 trillion figure tied to the chip ecosystem matters less as a number and more as a measure of dependence. When trillions of dollars rely on seamless coordination, even small disruptions stop feeling manageable. This is why comments from leaders at companies like TSMC, Intel, and major cloud providers have shifted in tone over time. They talk less about efficiency and more about resilience, less about margins and more about security of supply. That change does not happen because of one crisis, but because repeated stress teaches systems where they are vulnerable. China's role in chips has become one of those vulnerabilities that companies now plan around rather than ignore. I find it telling that governments and corporations are now using the same language when discussing semiconductors. Once a commercial product starts being discussed as strategic infrastructure, the market around it changes permanently. Infrastructure cannot fail gracefully, and it cannot wait for markets to self-correct. This is where supply chains quietly stop behaving like markets and start behaving like insurance systems. People pay more, accept delays, and redesign processes simply to avoid exposure to a single point of failure. None of this creates panic, but it creates pressure, and pressure accumulates even when prices stay calm. Markets often mistake calm prices for solved problems, when in reality they only reflect delayed consequences. I believe we are in that delay phase now, where adaptation is happening faster than understanding. China's chip position is not collapsing, but it is no longer trusted the way it once was. Trust is the most important input in global supply chains, and it is also the hardest one to measure. When trust weakens, systems do not stop overnight. They slowly rewrite how they operate. That rewrite is already underway, even if most people still think the story is about the past. The real shock is not what China might lose, but how much the world is already acting as if something has changed. And once behavior changes at this scale, the supply chain you thought you knew quietly stops existing in the same way. The moment this story became serious for me was not a policy announcement, but when CEOs started warning without sounding alarmist. When Jensen Huang from NVIDIA said that chips are now part of national infrastructure, that was not marketing, it was a signal. He was not talking about faster GPUs or gaming demand. He was talking about governments, security, and long-term access. That kind of language does not appear unless the rules of the system have already changed behind the scenes. Pat Gelsinger at Intel has been even more direct, repeatedly saying that globalization of chips is over, whether people like it or not. In my opinion, when executives who benefit from global efficiency start talking about fragmentation, you should pay attention. These are not activists or politicians. They are operators who understand costs better than anyone else. They know exactly how expensive inefficiency is, which means They only accept it when risk feels worse than cost. TSMC has quietly echoed the same idea, stressing that advanced manufacturing can no longer exist without political alignment. That is an extraordinary statement for a company built on neutrality and scale, and it tells you how tight the pressure is. My view is that China is not losing chips, but the world is losing confidence in a single-center system. Confidence is everything in supply chains because planning assumes tomorrow will look like yesterday. Once that assumption weakens, companies do not wait for collapse. They diversify early and quietly. We already see this with massive investments in US, Europe, and Japan that make no short-term economic sense. Those fabs cost more, take longer, and produce less efficiently than China-centered supply once did. Yet governments and companies are funding them anyway, which tells you this is about control, not optimization. I believe this is where the $2 trillion problem really sits, not in missing chips, but in duplicated systems. Duplication is expensive, slow, and messy, but it is what people build when they are afraid of dependency. If China retains dominance, costs rise and politics tighten, but if China is cut out, shortages return quickly. Either path creates stress, and that is why this crisis feels quiet, but permanent. The future of supply chains will likely be less efficient, more regional, and far more political than before. That does not mean collapse, but it does mean prices, timelines, and expectations will never return to old norms. In my view, the biggest mistake people make is thinking this is temporary pressure instead of structural change. Structural change does not reverse when headlines fade. It locks in through contracts, factories, and laws. Once that happens, the global system adapts around the new reality, not the old one. China will remain critical, but no longer trusted, as the single pillar holding everything together. And when pillars multiply, systems become safer but slower, heavier, and far more costly. That trade-off is already being accepted quietly, which means the future supply chain is already different. The shock is not coming later. It is already here, just spread out so evenly that it feels invisible. And markets always struggle to price invisible change until it suddenly becomes unavoidable. The most misunderstood part of the China chip crisis is the belief that something must visibly break before it becomes dangerous to the system. In reality, supply chains change direction long before they fail, because the goal of powerful players is always avoidance, not reaction. When companies sense that the future may be less predictable, they do not wait for shortages. They redesign how they operate in advance. That redesign is already happening, even though most consumers feel like chips are available and shelves are full again. I think this creates a false sense of resolution because availability today hides fragility tomorrow. Executives have been very clear about this if you listen closely to how they speak, not what headlines extract. Apple, for example, has quietly diversified production across multiple countries, even though it increases cost and complexity. Apple is famously obsessed with efficiency, so when it accepts inefficiency, it is doing so to reduce dependency risk. That tells me this is not about China collapsing as a producer, but about China becoming too central to ignore as a single point of failure. The same logic applies to cloud companies, automakers, and defense contractors, all of whom now plan for disruptions as a baseline. Once disruption becomes a baseline assumption, the system is already different, even if nothing dramatic has happened yet. In my view, this is where the idea of a $2 trillion problem becomes more psychological than financial. The money represents expectations built on smooth coordination, cheap scaling, and political neutrality. Those expectations are being rewritten, and rewriting expectations is far more disruptive than losing supply for a few months. When expectations change, contracts change, pricing models change, and long-term planning changes with them. This is why I believe the crisis is quiet, because it lives in spreadsheets, boardrooms, and legal language rather than warehouses. Governments amplify this effect by tying chips to national security, which forces companies to align with political priorities. Once politics enters supply chains directly, market logic becomes secondary, even if it still exists. That does not mean chaos, but it does mean slower decisions, higher costs, and less flexibility across the board. From my perspective, the future supply chain will not be broken, but it will be heavier and harder to move. Heavy systems resist shock better, but they also respond more slowly to opportunity and innovation. This trade-off is rarely discussed publicly because it sounds like decline even when it is actually adaptation. I think people underestimate how permanent these adaptations tend to be once capital is committed. Factories do not move easily, and laws do not reverse quickly once national interests are involved. China will still be central, but not trusted in the same way, and trust is the lubricant of global trade. Without trust, systems compensate with redundancy, and redundancy always costs more than efficiency. Those costs will not show up as a single spike, but as a long-term drag on growth and coordination. This is why I see the chip crisis as a slow-moving force rather than a sudden event. It reshapes incentives quietly, making the world more cautious even when conditions look stable. And markets struggle most with slow forces because they do not trigger fear, only adjustment. By the time adjustment is obvious, the old system is already gone. The China shock is not about what might happen next month, but about what will never go back to normal again. And that realization matters far more than any temporary shortage or headline-driven panic. The future of global supply chains now depends on a choice no one likes to make, because every option carries real costs and long delays. Either the world keeps relying heavily on China while accepting geopolitical risk, or it builds parallel systems that are slower and more expensive. In my opinion, what we are watching is not a debate, but a decision already made quietly through capital spending and policy alignment. The United States did not pass the CHIPS Act because markets asked for it, but because dependency started to feel strategically dangerous. Europe followed the same path for similar reasons, even though everyone involved knows local production cannot compete on cost alone. Japan has taken a quieter approach, focusing on resilience and partnerships rather than dominance, but the motivation is the same. These moves tell me that governments no longer trust markets to self-correct in something this critical. Once governments step in at this scale, the market stops being just a market and starts behaving like infrastructure. Infrastructure is built for reliability, not speed, and reliability always trades efficiency for control. That trade-off will shape the next decade of supply chains more than any single breakthrough or shortage. From my perspective, this is why the $2 trillion number matters so much, because it reflects how much value is exposed to this choice. When trillions depend on coordination, even small misalignments become politically unacceptable. China understands this dynamic as well, which is why it continues investing heavily in domestic capacity and self-sufficiency. Those investments are not short-term responses, they are long-term bets that fragmentation is here to stay. If fragmentation continues, global trade does not collapse, but it becomes regional, layered, and slower to respond. Slower systems are safer in crises, but they also dampen growth and raise costs across industries. That pressure will not show up as a single shock, but as a persistent drag that changes expectations everywhere. I think this is where many analysts underestimate the impact, because they look for dramatic outcomes instead of gradual constraint. Gradual constraint is harder to explain, but it shapes behavior more reliably than sudden panic. Companies will continue adapting quietly, even if consumers feel nothing for years. By the time effects reach everyday life, the decisions causing them will be long past debate. This is why the most important part of the China shock is not what happens next, but what is already locked in. Factories are being built, laws are being written, and alliances are being reshaped around a new assumption of risk. Once capital commits at this scale, reversal becomes almost impossible. The supply chain of the future is being designed under stress, not optimism. That means it will prioritize survival over elegance and control over efficiency. Those priorities make sense individually, but collectively they change how the global economy feels. Growth becomes steadier but slower, innovation becomes safer but narrower, and trade becomes more political. None of this means decline, but it does mean a different rhythm than the one people grew used to. In my view, this is the real consequence of the China chip shock, not a shortage, but a new baseline. A baseline where uncertainty is assumed and resilience is paid for up front. Once that mindset takes hold, markets do not go back to pretending risk is temporary. They build around it, and that is exactly what is happening now. The most important thing to understand is that the China chip shock is not really about semiconductors, but about how the world handles dependency when trust starts to weaken. Chips are simply the clearest example because they sit at the center of technology, defense, energy, and everyday consumer products all at once. When one component touches everything, any uncertainty around it forces the entire system to rethink how it is organized. In my opinion, this is why people underestimate the importance of this moment, because they treat it as a tech issue instead of a systemic one. We are watching the same pattern that appeared in energy, shipping, and finance, where efficiency was slowly replaced by caution. For decades, the global system was optimized for cost and speed, assuming politics would stay mostly separate from production. That assumption no longer holds, and once it breaks in one critical sector, it spreads to others almost automatically. I believe chips are only the beginning because the logic being applied here will be reused for metals, energy inputs, and advanced materials. We already see this happening with rare earths, battery supply chains, and even basic industrial components once taken for granted. When governments and companies accept higher costs to reduce dependency, they signal a permanent shift in priorities. Permanent shifts do not reverse when conditions improve, because the memory of vulnerability does not fade easily. This is where my view becomes less optimistic than many analysts, because I do not see a return to the old global rhythm. Instead, I see a world where supply chains are more defensive, more regional, and more politically aligned. That world is more stable in crises, but it is also less dynamic, less forgiving, and more expensive to operate. Consumers may not notice this immediately, but over time it shows up as slower innovation cycles and higher baseline costs. Markets struggle with this kind of change because it does not produce a single dramatic event to react to. There is no crash to point at, no clear turning point, just a gradual tightening of how things move and where they can be made. From my perspective, this is exactly why the phrase quietly reshaping fits this story better than any alarmist headline. The real danger is not disruption, but normalization of higher friction across the global economy. Once friction becomes normal, growth assumptions built on speed and scale start to fail quietly. That failure does not look like collapse. It looks like disappointment relative to expectations. Expectations matter because markets, governments, and companies all plan based on assumed future growth. If growth slows structurally, not cyclically, many long-term models stop working the way they were designed. This is why the China chip shock should be viewed as a warning about the future of coordination, not just production. Coordination is the invisible force that made globalization feel effortless for so long. When coordination weakens, even slightly, everything becomes heavier, slower, and harder to align. I think this is the future we are moving toward, not because anyone wants it, but because trust is harder to rebuild than factories. Once trust is questioned, systems compensate with rules, redundancy, and control instead of openness. Those compensations keep things running, but they also change the character of the global economy. The world will still function. trade will continue and technology will advance, but under tighter constraints. Understanding that shift matters because it explains why many things may feel harder in the years ahead without an obvious reason. The China shock is not a single crisis to be solved, but a signal that the era of effortless globalization is ending. And when an era ends quietly, most people only realize it long after the rules have already changed. The hardest part of this story is accepting that nothing dramatic needs to happen next for the outcome to already be decided in practice. Markets, governments, and companies have already absorbed the lesson that dependence is no longer an abstract risk, but a strategic weakness. Once that lesson is learned, behavior changes permanently, even if headlines move on to something louder or more emotional. In my opinion, this is why so many people will misunderstand what comes next, because they will keep waiting for a visible crisis. They will expect shortages, collapses, or sudden shocks when the real impact arrives as slower growth and higher friction. That kind of outcome feels boring, yet it reshapes lives more deeply than any short-lived panic ever could. The global supply chain is not breaking apart, it is being rebuilt with fear and caution baked into every decision. Fear does not need to be emotional to be powerful, it only needs to influence incentives quietly and consistently. When incentives change, systems follow, even if people still use the same words to describe them. Companies will keep saying globalization exists, even as they design around its limits instead of its promises. Governments will keep talking about free markets, even as they intervene more directly in what gets built and where. Consumers will keep buying familiar products, even as costs creep higher and choices become narrower over time. None of this feels like a shock in the moment, which is why it is so easy to underestimate. I believe future historians will point to this period not as a crisis, but as a transition that few noticed while it happened. Transitions are uncomfortable because they lack a clear beginning and end, yet they change everything in between. The China chip shock fits that pattern perfectly because it altered trust without destroying functionality. Trust is the quiet foundation of global systems, and once it weakens, complexity replaces simplicity everywhere. Complex systems can be resilient, but they are never as fast or forgiving as simple ones. That loss of forgiveness is what people will feel most, even if they cannot name the cause. Innovation will continue, but it will take longer, cost more, and require more coordination than before. Trade will continue, but it will feel heavier, slower, and more political at every step. From my perspective, this is not a story about China winning or losing, but about the world adjusting to risk. China remains essential, but no longer singular, and that shift alone forces duplication across the system. Duplication is expensive, yet it becomes inevitable once trust erodes past a certain point. The $2 trillion figure attached to this story represents that duplication more than any single market loss. It is the cost of building a world that no longer assumes everything will always work smoothly. That cost will be paid slowly across years, budgets, and expectations, rather than all at once. Most people will never connect rising friction to this moment because the link is indirect and delayed. But the link exists, and it explains why the future may feel tighter, even when nothing appears broken. The real shock was not an event, but a realization that efficiency came with a hidden price. Now that price is being paid, quietly, deliberately, and without asking for attention. And once systems adapt to that payment, they rarely go back to pretending risk does not exist. That is how the China shock ends, not with collapse, but with a world that moves more carefully than before. By the time this becomes obvious, the old assumptions will already feel like history. The real ending of the China chip shock is not a solution or a collapse, because systems this large never resolve cleanly, they only transform slowly. Nothing dramatic needs to happen next for the outcome to already be locked in, because the most important change happened at the level of belief. The world no longer assumes that global supply chains will automatically fix themselves when pressure appears or politics get complicated. That assumption powered decades of efficiency, growth, and confidence, and once it weakens, every decision becomes heavier and slower. In my opinion, this is why the global economy suddenly feels harder to read, even when indicators suggest things are stable. The rules did not disappear, but they stopped being simple, and simplicity was what made globalization feel smooth and reliable. When simplicity fades, coordination replaces optimism, and coordination always requires more effort, more oversight, and more control. This story is not about China failing or the West winning, but about trust becoming conditional instead of automatic. Conditional trust changes everything, because every decision now comes with verification, redundancy, and political consideration. Companies plan more carefully, governments intervene more openly, and markets explain more defensively, yet confidence feels lower than before. That is not a contradiction. It is exactly how systems behave when uncertainty becomes permanent rather than temporary. I believe this is the world we are moving into, where efficiency is no longer the highest priority guiding global decisions. Resilience, redundancy, and control are replacing speed and optimization, even when those choices raise costs and reduce flexibility. These choices are rational at the individual level, but collectively they reshape how growth, innovation, and cooperation work. Growth becomes steadier but weaker, innovation becomes safer but slower, and coordination becomes more political at every stage. Most people will never connect those outcomes directly to chips, China, or a $2 trillion number. They will simply feel that progress takes longer, alignment is harder, and mistakes are punished more quickly than before. That feeling is the real legacy of this story, not a single headline or a specific market move. When systems lose forgiveness, small errors matter more, and pressure accumulates faster, even without visible shocks. This is why future disruptions may feel sharper, even if they begin from smaller and less dramatic causes. The world has quietly traded speed for caution and caution for control, without ever formally choosing to do so. Once that trade is made, it shapes every decision that follows, from factories to finance to geopolitics. From my perspective, this is the most important lesson of the China chip shock. Not that supply chains can break, but that they can change so quietly, people mistake caution for stability. Stability built on constant risk management looks calm on the surface, but it is never relaxed underneath. It requires continuous coordination, continuous oversight, and continuous fear of being caught unprepared. That effort keeps systems running, but it also drains flexibility, creativity, and tolerance for surprise. The global economy will continue to function, trade will continue, and technology will keep advancing. But it will feel different than the world people remember, heavier, slower, and more deliberate in every move. This is not the end of globalization, but it is the end of effortless globalization. And once effort becomes permanent, the rhythm of the world never fully returns to what it was. That is what is happening now, not loudly, not suddenly, but deeply and structurally. By the time everyone agrees on what changed, the change will already be complete. And that is why this story matters, even if nothing dramatic ever seems to happen next.